another big story this week, and I'm trying to balance the good news with the bad, right, during the Trump era, is that we had a bunch of primaries across the country, some of which were more or less a fait accompli in terms of the general election, where, and 2 weeks ago we had these primaries too, where many of our revolution and Justice Democrats and sort of the more progressive candidates lost to the more establishment, in some instances, more conservative candidates. And this past week was almost the opposite, where we saw, particularly in Pennsylvania, but in other states across the country, progressives win pretty big. In fact, there were 4 Democratic socialists who won in Pennsylvania, 2 of whom who will go on to will win the state house seats because there's no Republicans running against them. And then the other sort of concurrent story is that I think out of 20 women who ran in these primaries, 17 women won. And I don't know. I mean, we'll talk about this, but my sense is that at least on the ideological choosing ended the moment they saw a D. They're obviously in primaries, but it was really the candidacy of women that drove the votes for folks in this election. Give me your sense.
Well, I mean, yeah, it seems. I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting to me the fact that you contrasted these 2 different weeks of primaries. With the 2 different takes that people had coming out of it. And, I'll be curious to see how that goes over the next, month or so of primaries as we really get this primary season going. Because I think part of it is what you said about the fact that, if a woman is running and she checks off all the boxes that you care about, in some way or another, and she's got a D after her name. I think a lot of Democrats are just going, you know what, I'm going with it, and I'm going with her. And the reason being, and sorry, I don't mean to evoke a Hillary slogan, that was unconscious. But I do think that there is a feeling out there among plenty of people, maybe mostly women, but I suspect plenty of Democratic men are feeling the same way, that it's just, this is ridiculous, that, there's this utter misogynist pig in the White House, that this guy in Missouri, he's, some S&M guy who is, basically refusing to resign even though it's obvious that he's an abuser of women. And the Democrats are, they're taking a stand on this. They're being clear. I mean, look what happened to Eric Schneiderman in New York. There was a Democrat who was doing great work on behalf of the party, and a lot of people for many years apparently had sort of soft-pedaled these issues that they knew he had. But right now, they're going, no, we're not doing that anymore. And when it came out, it was over, and he was done. And he was, no matter how good he was, or even somebody like Al Franken. I mean, this is where the Democratic Party is right now, and I think it's a principled stand, and I'm happy to see it. As for the ideology, I mean, I think maybe we're going to see, and we don't know how this is going to shake out, but, in places where this sort of class issue is important to, some swing voters and maybe even some Trump voters, where that was one of their motivations in voting for Trump, or looking at maybe, trying to make a statement about class, that, some of these, more ideologically left, economically left candidates may do pretty well. I mean, maybe this is the big test. We're going to see whether or not that happens in November. But in those places where that is a, particularly salient issue, maybe this is going to be the big test of that, and see how that plays in those areas. And in other areas where it's other issues, maybe there are people, that there's all this talk about the white college-educated in the suburbs who have a different set of issues that they're looking at. I mean, they all sort of mesh together. It's not as if they're in conflict. But, all of that is playing itself out, and I think it's very interesting. The Democrats are doing, they're coming out in big numbers, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I will say this, too, and I know we've mentioned this on this program a couple of times, but there have been 2 big pieces that have been written, and maybe more than two, but The Intercept has been writing a couple of pieces about how the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, has been swooping in and siding against the more progressive candidates in some races. And the take is they're not listening to locals, and it's ideological. And then on this program, we've also interviewed Lena Putnam, who did a study with Theda Skutchbull that showed a similar dynamic, but it wasn't necessarily along ideological lines. Part of what they found in that study, too, those two, was that the real energy in the Democratic Party is coming from women. And, as you said, that there's part of what is driving it, I think, is the complete lack of accountability that we saw in regards of Donald Trump. And then you have people like Roy Moore and, like you say, we've seen this on and on. But the interesting thing here is going to be to see if not just, where these lines break down in terms of whether women candidates are going to do that much better, or whether there's going to be a real move for progressive candidates, but there's also going to be a tremendous amount of scrutiny on the DCCC, and their efficacy is going to be, like I say, highly scrutinized. And it's going to be interesting to see, and we'll talk a little bit about this. We got to take a break. We got to come back. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But there was a race, for instance, in Nebraska, where we're going to have a really good test case to see how the DCCC is going to react to their preferred candidate losing, and whether or not they're operating, how exactly they're operating. Because I think this is a big issue, not necessarily an ideological one, although it might be, but certainly one of efficiency. If there's anything the Democrats can't afford to do, is to be working against their own best interests. And sometimes I think there's a tendency for the DCCC to do that for a number of reasons. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more from Digby. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.